Thank you very much for this interview, Thomas. I have your book here by Grano de Sal in Mexico. It's a wonderful work. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
I would like to start by asking you, some people think that inequalities are something inevitable, even something necessary. What would you say to them? In which cases are inequalities particularly damaging for our societies?
Well, what I would say to them is, if you look at the evolution of inequality across societies, what you can see is a lot of variation over time across period. And, at every time period, you have people and very often dominant groups, who try to naturalize inequality, to present the current level and structure of inequality as if it was natural, as if it was the only possible organization of society. And in fact, that's not what you observe in history. You observe in history, very fast changes, in particular following a political mobilization and ideological change. And by putting all this, very broad set of historical data and historical trajectories together in my new book, looking beyond Western countries, looking at India, looking at the colonial societies, looking at China, looking at Haiti, looking at Brazil, trying to have a much bigger scope than in my previous book. The big conclusion is that ideological change and political change is really the true driver of the level and structure of inequality over time. So the question is not, I'm not saying, nobody is saying that we should have perfect, complete equality, because people are different and people may make different choices with their lives, they may have different objectives. But the problem is to find, the right compromise and the right level and structure of inequality. And of course, that's very complicated. And, I don't have a magic formula for that, but I think that by looking at all these different historical experience, we can make, have a more informed opinion. And also, I think this is what societies are doing to some extent. They try to react to new challenges, to new crises in order to change their system. So for instance, in the 20th century, following the Great Depression, you had a major transformation of the tax system with the rise of progressive taxation, including, very steeply progressive taxation, for instance, in a country like the US between the 1920s and the 1970s. And this completely transforms the level of inequality. You have the rise of the welfare state, the rise of social security system, and I try to show how this transformation, in the end, in the long run, have led to a big reduction of inequality, which together with the rise of economic prosperity. So, the good news and the optimistic message coming from this book is that in the long run, economic prosperity actually comes from a reduction of inequality, and in particular from a relatively inclusive and egalitarian investment in education. If you look at the countries in the world that have been the most successful, like during the 20th century, the economic leadership of the United States largely relied on the fact that the country was also, at least until recently, an educational leader. So, in the middle of the 20th century, in the 1950s, you have 90% of a generation in the US going to high school at a time when it was only between 20% and 30% in Western Europe or in Japan. And this is why you had such a high level of productivity. So it was not the pursuit of inequality and always more inequalities that led to prosperity. And Ronald Reagan in the 1920s tried to change the narrative and the ideology by saying, well, in fact, Roosevelt and the New Deal and Kennedy and Johnson, have gone too far with the welfare state and the reduction of inequality. We are going to have more inequality, more billionaire at the top, but this is what will bring more growth, more innovation, and everybody's income is going to grow faster than before, and in the end, this is going to be beneficial for everybody. This could have been true, but in the end, that's not what we've seen. And what we've seen is a reduction by 2 of the growth rate, in the US, between 1990 and 2020, it was only 1.1% per year. If you look at national income per capita, as compared to 2.2% per year in the 1950 to 1990. And I think that's also why today, in the US, there's a new change in ideology that is to some extent going on with either the rise of nationalism, on the Trump side, with sort of trying to find some new narrative and some new explanation for why the US middle class or lower economic group did not benefit from the growth that Reagan had promised. And so it comes with all sorts of explanation, as you very well know. In Mexico, he's trying to blame Mexican workers, he's trying to blame China, he's trying to blame Europe, he's trying to blame the rest of the world. But there's also another possible narrative and storytelling that can come with the rise of a more social democratic regulation of capitalism, or even the rise of some new form of socialism, with Bernie Sanders. And so societies, try to react to what they perceive as new challenges, by changing their views on how to organize the economy. And, all I'm trying to do in my work is to provide readers with these very broad sets of historical trajectories, so that we can make our own mind for the future. And also, to me, the biggest enemy is always nationalism, in a way, and in particular intellectual nationalism, which very often makes societies reluctant to compare themselves to other countries. So they learn from their own experience, which is already something. But I think we can learn a lot more by putting our national trajectories, which are all unique in certain dimensions, but which are never as unique as
Let me stop you there, Dr. Piketty, because in your book you explain how Sweden was for a long time an extremely unequal country. However, political mobilizations have transformed this country, and if someone had predicted in 1910 that Sweden would become a social democratic country, nobody would have taken it seriously. Nowadays, Mexico is one of the most unequal countries in the world. What are the major changes that we would need to experience to change this scenario?
That's a good question, and I'm afraid I might not know enough about Mexico to provide a complete answer. But at least the good news for Mexico, and the good news for the world in general, is that indeed no country is set to remain very unequal or very equal forever. And things can change through political mobilization and learning from other countries, and things can change very fast. And so the case of Sweden, which I did not know as well before I did the research for this book, is particularly striking, because today we tend to look at Sweden as sort of permanently equal, but in fact, until 1911, the country was one of the most unequal in Europe, and was very sophisticated in its political organization of inequality. So between 1865 and 1911 in Sweden, you could have between 1 and 100 voting rights, depending on how wealthy you are. Well, the bottom 80% will not vote at all, but within the top 20% male wealth holders and property owners, you could have between 1 and 100 voting rights. And in municipal elections, there was actually no upper limit, so that in several dozen municipalities, there was only, you could have one individual with more than 50% of the vote. And even, corporations had the right to vote in municipal election, which is, today, maybe that would be a dream of a billionaire or, corporation owners, who would like to have a political system like this, but, they cannot really ask for that directly. They have to find ways, sometimes through foundation or political funding of parties, to have this kind of influence, but they cannot have it directly through the political system. This was Sweden until 1911, and it is only through the big mobilization by the working class in Sweden and trade unions and social democratic parties. So maybe the lesson for Mexico, but I think for all other countries, is that you have a complementarity between a sort of bottom-up mobilization by trade unions, by workers' association, and also political mobilization coming from elections. And it was really this mixture of a big trade union mobilization from the bottom and an electoral victory by the Social Democratic Party in 1932, and a major political platform of transformation of the economic system. So, there was the very ambitious program of building universal public services in education, in health, financed by large progressive taxation of income and wealth, more workers' rights in corporations, so something that was done in Sweden and also in Germany after World War II, in a context where the elite had been largely, discredited by the war and everything, and the working class was in a position to ask for major change. They obtained the fact that in large corporations in Sweden and in Germany and in many other Nordic countries in Europe, workers can have and still have until today up to 50% of voting rights in the board of large corporations, even without any share in the capital of the company. Just as workers, they have 50% of voting rights in the boards of large corporations in Germany. So, and if in addition to that, they have 10 or 20% of the stock of the company, or if a local government has 10 or 20% of the stock of the company, which sometimes happens, it means that you can shift the majority and actually take majority control of the board of the company, even though there is a shareholder who has 70 or 80% ownership in the stock of the company. So you can see, this is really a major transformation of the very notion of private property based on one share, one vote ID. And what's very interesting is that, this system has been in place in Germany, Sweden, Norway for, since the 1950s, for more than half a century, has been very successful in the sense that I think it allowed for a better involvement of workers in the long-run strategy of companies in these countries. But this was not extended to other countries. This was not extended to Mexico so far, but I think it could be extended to Mexico, but it was not extended to the US or to Britain or to France, because somehow shareholders, managed to resist the pressure, and also because I think there was not enough appropriation, by citizen, workers, trade union representative, political party leaders, that this could be something to be done, and this is something. We don't need to have a world agreement. We don't need to have every country do it. Sweden, Germany did it without asking, the European Union or the United Nations to do that everywhere. And so why didn't it happen in other countries? I think the balance of power was different, but also, as I was mentioning before, sometimes you have some intellectual nationalism and lack of knowledge about what is done in other countries. And so,
let me move to another example that you also analyze in your book, which is the case of Brazil. You say that the progress made by the Workers' Party, the party of Lula in government, has made a rather moderate performance in terms of tax reform, and you also say that the social policies implemented by the Workers' Party in government were mainly at the expense of the middle classes rather than the well-off, which didn't really pay more taxes. You also argued that this was due to the ideological limitations or ideological weaknesses you also say about, in general, about social democracy in the last few decades. And also you say that that was because of the international context. However, the truth is that the Workers' Party in government did not have a majority in Congress. However, now coming back to Mexico, it's quite striking because here the situation is different. Here the left does have a parliamentary base that no other party had in Mexico since the democratic transition. And yet, tax reform is not really on the agenda. Would you say that this government that we have in Mexico is somehow ideologically weak?
I'm not here to give lessons to Mexico or to anybody. I don't know enough about Mexico, to give lessons like this and say who's weak and who's strong. Let me simply say, in the case of Brazil, it's clear that the institutional structure of Brazilian democracy and the fact that the Workers' Party never had a majority was a major limitation. And I really stress in my book, the interplay between economic and political reform. So if you don't have the right institution, in the case of Brazil, Lula was re-elected with more than 60% of the vote in some of the presidential election. So with some other electoral system for Congress, in many other countries, this would have been well enough to have an absolute majority of seats. But because the way the electoral system is organized in Brazil, with the election of Congress representative at the level of state, with the electoral system, in fact, it's very complicated, if not impossible, to get a majority. And I'm not saying it's simple to change this. I'm just saying that you have things like that in many other countries in the world, like in France until World War II, the Senate, which was not elected by universal suffrage, had veto power on everything, and it is only after this veto power was removed after World War II that it was possible to pass a social security system, a very progressive income tax system. So, and today, if you have unanimity rule over taxation in Europe, of course, it makes it very complicated to have any taxation. So all these institutional rules are important. Now, in the case of Mexico, again, I don't know enough about the context, but let me simply say that Mexico, maybe one of the particularity of the trajectory, is a relatively weak centralized state. The total tax revenue going to the central government in Mexico are relatively limited. There's limited administrative capacity and transparency about income and wealth and property. So how do you get away from this? I'm not saying it's simple. That's certainly a major difference with when we were discussing the case of Sweden before. Even when Sweden was very unequal in the beginning of the 20th century, it was unequal with a very strong state capacity and a very well-developed registration of individual property and wealth. So initially, this very strong state capacity was used in a very unequal manner to protect the political rights of the wealthy. But then, once you take control of this state capacity, you can use it for a different political project. In the case of Mexico, the state capacity, for all sorts of historical reasons, also the size of Mexico, there are all sorts of specific historical reasons which contribute to explain why we are clearly not in the same situation, and you have also, of course, the very bad negative influence of the drug economy, the drug traffic, which is largely due to the fact that you have drug consumers in the US or in other parts of the world, which are also, contributing to create this huge difficulty. Mexico had an enormous demographic growth over the course of the past 100 years, which, of course, makes it much more complicated to invest in public infrastructure, public services than in a country that had a very small and stagnant population like France in the 19th century or in most of the 20th century. So there are many particularities, but certainly building a more equitable tax system and a better registration of wealth and property and income is very important. So you cannot.
That was my next question. You have very interesting proposals to make a more progressive fiscal system. You talk about a property tax, income tax, inheritance tax, and also a carbon emissions tax. What would be the purpose of all these taxes?
Well,
you seem to like taxation. It seems to be part of your a very important part of your social participatory the participatory socialism that you propose.
Well, the rise historically, the rise of European countries, but also the rise of the US, came with the rise of centralized state power and taxation in order to invest in education, in health, in public infrastructure. So sometimes this taxation is also used to make war and to do spendings which are less useful for economic prosperity, economic growth. But if you use taxation well, then I think indeed this is part of a successful development trajectory. Now, one interesting lesson, I think, for a country like Mexico is that historically, in order to gradually develop such a fiscal and social system, and again, Mexico is not going to become Sweden in one day, but the question is, how do you move in this kind of direction? Even though of course there's a lot more to invent than just Sweden, and everybody has to invent a different system adapted to the country. But one important lesson is that you need to have a balance between taxation of income and taxation of wealth. So income is the new flow of income that you earn each year, whereas wealth or property is the total stock of what you own. And historically, in the 19th century, tax on the stock, on property were much more important than tax on the flow of income in European countries, but also in the US, where the property tax, which is still today very important, was a major source of revenue. Income tax have become more important during the 20th century, largely for good reason. But I think today, at the beginning of the 21st century, I think we need to put more emphasis on wealth taxation than what we did in recent decades, partly because, well, first, there are two reasons for that. The first reason is that if you don't have a proper registration of assets and capital ownership, then it's very difficult to have a proper system of taxation of income and profit. So typically, if you have a very large informal sector, which can happen in many countries, including in Mexico, with companies, small shops or small businesses that are not registered, that you don't know whether they own this particular shop or this particular piece of property, then it's hopeless to think that they are going to pay the income tax or that they are going to have a sophisticated system of profit taxation or income taxation or even value-added taxation. So the basic taxation, even if it's at a small tax rate of property, including business property, has been very important historically in all countries that are today's rich, in order at least to have a capacity to register, who owns what in the country. Because if you don't know well who owns what, there's not much that you can do in order to further develop the tax system and the state capacity of the country. Then, once you know that, you can develop more the income tax system. And I think one of the problems in Mexico, but also in many other countries around the world, is that many have tried to go too fast to directly to taxing income and taxing the flow without developing the proper system of property taxation and registration of property. So this has to be put in the thinking about how to develop the tax system in the long run, together with the new reflection on carbon taxation, which is really something. It's a new challenge. We've never done that before, and again, we are going to have to invent a right compromise between efficiency and equity. And if we have no progressivity in the taxation of carbon emission, and if we tax the poor and the people who have very small level of carbon emission at the same rate as the very rich, and sometimes even at a higher rate than the very rich who escape carbon taxation through various ways, that's not going to work. People are going to reject carbon taxation. And I think this is a general lesson for all taxes, that you have to build some sense of justice and some consensus about social and economic justice.
Sure.
If you want to build trust in the state and in the process of economic development. And this has to be very gradual. And again, in a country like Mexico, I'm not saying that's simple and that can be done in one day, but there is the
political strength to increase taxes, especially to the well-off, and it's a shame that it's not really on the agenda of this administration. But we're running out of time, Thomas, and I would like to ask you a final question. Major changes are expected, or everybody is expecting major changes after this pandemic. In Mexico, our president has insisted recently that not only material well-being and economic growth is important, but there's also, and we don't only have to look at GDP, but we also need to look at other measurements of well-being and even create our own measure of happiness. Does that make any sense to you, particularly in this post-COVID era?
Well, yeah, it's clear that we have to change the way we measure economic success and economic welfare. And I think GDP is a very poor measure of economic welfare for several reasons. Well, first of all, the first obvious change that we should make is, which I try to do it in my work, we should talk about national income rather than GDP. The big difference is that to go from GDP to national income, you have to take away the foreign income, so the income going abroad, which is not available in the country that we consider. And also you have to take away the consumption of fixed capital, including the consumption of natural resources. So, if you take 100 billion euros or dollars from the ground and burn it, that will give you 100 billion euro of GDP, but in fact, €0 of national income. And if in addition, when you burn these oil reserves, you contribute to global warming and to make the planet unbearable. If you put a price to this carbon emission, this will give you a negative national income as opposed to a positive GDP. So you can see how changing the indicator can change completely the way you evaluate policy, both at the government level, at the company level. Now, that's not enough. We also need some other, non-monetary indicators, including pure environmental indicators, including looking at the vacation time, labor time, because of course, if you work 50 hours per week and have no vacation, we have a higher GDP per capita. But is this really what people are looking for? And when you compare level of GDP per capita across countries, generally speaking, there's much more, vacation and much shorter working weeks in Europe than in the US, for instance. And, that's obviously something that needs to be taken into account when we measure welfare. That being said, I think pure environmental indicator, or pure non-monetary or happiness indicator will not be enough. We also need to look at income and wage and wealth. If we want to build some sense of economic justice, transparency about the distribution of income and wealth in particular is very important. And I think this is an area where Mexico can make a lot of progress. We are trying you know, with the World Inequality Database, which is a very large international network of researchers trying to measure inequality, you know, we're trying to integrate Mexico into our database, and we have lots of great researchers, including from Mexico and other Latin American countries, working with Mexican data, and you know, we have big limitations in what, you know, what we are able to measure and what we know and what we don't know about the distribution of income and wealth in Mexico. And I think, you know, if this government could contribute to bring more transparency about, you know, who earns what and who owns what in Mexico, I think that would be, you know, at least as useful as providing some direct measure of happiness. But, you know, of course, both are important.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Piketty. Congratulations for this wonderful book. I'm reading it, and I think I'm enjoying this one better than the previous one. It's also easy reading. It's not. One would think that such a long book would be difficult to read, and I would like to say that it's very well written, and it's also easy to read. You just need a lot of time, but. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Congratulations. Bye-bye.